I want to thank everyone for joining the session as we are in our new world of how we are joining various conferences and summits and all sorts of meetings, both with sites as well as vendors. I'm going to spend about the next 30 minutes or so talking about specifically the sites and patients, because quite frankly, with all the tools that any vendor can bring forward to us or to the sites, it really comes down to the sites and the patients, because that is the group that is the mainstay for our work. As any other presentation, I'm sure we are all familiar with the disclaimer slides. I do want to let you know what I am presenting to you does not necessarily reflect policy or corporate position for Meitheal Specialty Pharma or Zentria. And let's go ahead into the material. One of the things that I wanted to spend a little time on is certainly talking about it from a time point. And we certainly know that 2019, we were all moving along. We had our processes, we had our CROs, we had the way in which we worked and partnered with the various clinical sites. It was the world before COVID-19. We are now in the first half of 2020. Almost all of us, very few and far between, have not felt some level of impact. Whether you are talking about as a sponsor company, as a vendor supporting various sponsors, as you are talking about sites, or even the subjects who have been involved in ongoing trials. This first half of 2020, with the global stay-in-place approach, really took everyone down to I will say, a common denominator of what's next? What are we going to do? And as we come into the second half of 2020, it is really nice to see that we are even cautiously beginning to return to business. And as usual, really should be in quotation marks, because I'm not sure if it's ever really going to be as usual before COVID-19. But we do come into this with some questions, both from the sites and by us who are running the clinical trials. We have a level of concern we have to address, both for the volunteers and patients in our trials, the sites, and our own management teams. So where and what are we going to do? Regardless, all of these are founded within a level of flexibility and adaptability. And we move that way into 2021, where I do believe, whether from the sites or the sponsors or the vendors, we will see a new set of best practices, always keeping in mind, of course, that we do still need to comply with many of the regulations. If you think about what's come out in the last few months, there have been guidelines, there are recommendations, but the basics behind the laws, ICH, GCP, have not changed. Those regulations remain. The new norm is really going to be around being able to work with sites to conduct the studies with a certain increased level of attention to risk management. And that is really what I'm going to take some time to talk about. We could probably spend a week on this as everything is opening back up, but we will try and do this in about 30 minutes or so. The 5 key challenges that I have over the years sort of helped my teams and taking the approach with sites and vendors has basically been, there's some key challenges that as long as we meet them and we pay attention to them, we will all have successful clinical trials. Certainly, first and foremost is that we would like to be running the trials with safe and efficacious therapeutic interventions. We want to be able to show that these trial designs, that the sites are confident that we have built them with scientifically and clinically sound parameters. But I'm highlighting the next two because this is really where we're going to be having to put a little bit more attention. It really is going to be around having much stronger relationships and partnerships between sponsor, sites, and CROs. We all talk about this. We've been talking about it for the 2 decades at least that I've been involved in drug development, but I think it takes on a little bit different of a level of attention right now. And we do want to be working with experienced sites. And that may be a little bit broader of a definition now for us in order for them to also be able to bring on subjects and patients who are really both engaged and excited as well as willing to participate in the trials. Data acquisition, transfer, and final analysis remains important, and there's a lot of attention, of course, going on around how data risk management is taking place, how data transfers are being handled, and even prior to final analysis, how we as sponsors and the sites are looking at any missing data. Altogether, these 5 key challenges and criteria have their place in what ultimately becomes the regulatory dossier for any of us as we move therapies forward. So I've already mentioned the partnership between a sponsor and a CRO. We have to be much clearer now about our goals, what's okay, what isn't okay. We have to be much clearer now in understanding the science behind the disease and the therapy we are developing. We have to really work together on understanding the regulatory hurdles and understanding the patients, because as we both, as sponsor and CRO, reach out to qualify the sites, we do want to be able to communicate that post-COVID-19, the goals are still clear for drug development. We are still focusing on science and the disease, but we will work closely with them to make sure that all of the regulatory hurdles can be met, can be addressed, because even for them, as we qualify them, they may have some new criteria they themselves have to meet, and that becomes important as we talk to them about enrolling and engaging patients to become part of our work. They may have some very different criteria. They may have some different opinions on how to qualify and enroll the patients themselves. So therein, if we are well partnered with the CRO as a sponsor, that will allow us to work a bit more transparently and effectively with the clinical sites and centers as we move forward. In the site selection, I like to sort of talk about the unique areas in doing clinical trials. And I put 3 particular ones for us to keep in mind. Again, thinking about the current new world, so to speak, gene therapy, vaccines, and rare disease. Why these 3? The reason for these 3 is basically because we end up talking about some rather unique patient populations that then put us in partnership with very unique sites, the ability to deliver gene therapies. Not all clinical sites are able to do that. And gene therapy already has some very specific requirements in being able to enroll the patients, in being able to run these trials. So we need to be thinking about these kinds of aspects. Vaccines, well, we all know, we just heard and saw yesterday the news that even as there are, I believe right now, some 19 different parties working on the development of vaccines for COVID-19. Even with vaccines, there are some unique elements on how to run the trials, how to deliver supply, how to prepare the patients. And if we are talking about, let's say, rare diseases, these are in themselves requiring very specific sites to be part of the trials, but they may also be looking at patient populations that will be more prone, perhaps to comorbidities, may have immune compromised systems. And so we want to be sure that as we work with the sites, that they are sites that can meet whatever these special requirements may be, whether it's about the therapy being developed or about the patient population. We talk about increased need for experienced sites. Now we are having to think about something else. We have been talking about virtual clinical trials for about the last 5 years. They sort of peeked out from under the basket, and there's been a lot of talk about them, but I will tell you, any of us who are running trials have seen this really become a reality in the last few months. But does that mean we're going to go automatically to virtual trials? I think what we are going to see as we work with the sites is that they themselves are not ready to go completely to virtual, but it will become a type of transitional or hybrid type of trials. And so we need to be sure as we select the sites that they know what they need to do. They are operating within their own guidelines. They understand there are some differences between the telemedicine approach and clinical research, because even as you move to the virtual, GCP ICH guidelines would still apply. The increased need for scientifically strong protocols, we know that even from a screening standpoint, we want to be sure that they are sites that are comfortable with any of the changes that we are putting in for inclusion-exclusion criteria around the more prone to infection patients, around the screening for COVID-19. Now it's not just HCV and HIV. There are going to be some additional things that we will put in protocols, and sites need to be comfortable with those kinds of changes. The increased flexibility, the sites themselves, I've already been hearing, my apologies for the typo, they are policing on a policy standpoint. There are certain things that they need to be more effectively operationalizing, simply because if they are part of an institution, it is a requirement for them. The new guidelines that have come out, any new guidelines that we as sponsors have. I've already mentioned the screening methods and the clinical operations approaches, which have changed. Remote monitoring, again, now becoming more effective in working with the sites, more support from our CROs, more adaptability as sponsors, and the sites making sure that they are ready to do this. And I heard something earlier this morning at another presentation where someone summarized it as the flexibility we need with sites and selecting them as a sponsor is understanding the stuff, the staff, and the space, because that really plays into being able to do some of these new methods and techniques. So they may be a site that's ready and wants to do the new studies, but their staff is not fully trained in some of the new methods. So we have to take care of that. And when we are talking about the remote monitoring, keep in mind, it's not just about the monitor at the other end of the call who will have, let's say, their at office or home office space. There needs to be space at the site where they have either Wi-Fi or phone connection or both to be able to go through some of the monitoring with activities with the sponsor monitor and not disrupt everything else that may be going on at the site, because it won't be just one study. So space becomes important, and we need to ask the sites about these things now. So managing risk is about the staff as well as the patient, because ultimately, the more we have the transparency and the operational ability to manage these risks at the site level, the more we can feel confident that the study outcomes will be, if not positive relative to objective, at the very least have the integrity that we need in order to be able to make a decision about the trial. And compliance also, because even though we are moving to more of the remote, even when you talk about virtual trials, the compliance aspects have not diminished. So when we have looked at sites before in trying to determine if we would like to select them for a trial, especially when you have unique therapeutic interventions or unique patient populations, we have asked and worked with the CROs and the sites to try and get some information about how long does it take them to get going from a startup standpoint. How difficult has it been to put CTAs and agreements together? Are they part of a centralized IRB system? How negotiable are they when we talk about the study costs at the site level? What's been their history, compliance and deviation wise? How have they done on inspections? Have they been able to show that they can recruit for other trials, whether our own or not? And how has the data quality been? So now, when we are looking at sites and we have to think about performance before selecting them, those same criteria remain. But we have a few additional things now we need to think about and discuss, whether with the site directly or to the sites via a CRO. What has their flexibility been? How transparent are they being about new requirements? How open have they been in communications or willing to be to talk about what has changed and what a sponsor needs to be thinking about? How well are they engaged in managing the balance between any of their own state regulations? Because if you think about it now, each state is hearing some different guidelines by which they are expected to operate. And when you are talking about state institutions or VA centers, you need to keep those things in mind, as well as then discussing with them any impact on whether or not they will comply with GCP and ICH regulations as well. And have they now been asked to move away from centralized IRBs and go to local IRBs because of new rules and boundaries? So when we are talking to sites prior to selecting them, these become some key questions, whether we have the CRO ask them or whether we ask them ourselves. Adjusting timelines. Again, we have to be aware of things can happen unexpectedly, some related to the trial, some certainly not related to the trial. So how do we handle these? How quickly can we adjust timelines, whether it's for data entry and or transfer, or even for adjusting patient visits and procedures? ICFs now. More than ever, we need to be very clear in the ICFs and the processes. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. It's a little bit different because the subjects, the patients, how do we get them into the study? How do we assure ourselves that the requirements that the site must show us they have complied with in delivering the informed consent have been followed? I've already mentioned a little bit about remote monitoring partnership because it plays into risk assessment and risk management and monitoring issues. To how are we going to resolve them when it's on the basis of remote monitoring? How do we assure ourselves that the issues have been dealt with? And I'm going to bring up one additional item. For those of us who have sat through and reviewed many redlined CTAs with multiple sites, whether they are under a MSA with the center or whether they are individual CTAs, there is always the force majeure clauses in there. And I am now hearing sites tell us that they are being required to revisit those. That's part of the post-COVID-19, and you need to be sure that as you select a site, you are comfortable with whatever is going in there. I'm going to talk just for a moment about site interest, because we already know, certainly in the US, sites have shown a bit diminished interest in clinical research. It's not a profit class of work, and it requires quite a bit of effort. And we work with them as sponsors to keep them engaged. What I do want to be bringing up are 3 points with the sites. We need to be sure that the site is really willing to do the trial for the benefit of the patient and the benefit of overall clinical research. We want to be sure that the PI is supported by their institution to continue to take on new studies. I have been having some communications with sites where they have been asked, finish the ongoing studies as they come on board. Please don't take on any new studies just yet, because those institutions are really trying to determine what the criteria will be as they go forward. So as you select sites and you're talking to them, this is really important to find out from the PI. And I will add something here. Sometimes it's not so much the PI, it's talking to the site coordinators. The site coordinators are very well connected, even right now in the close down or slow down period. They know what the sites are having to deal with. And that's a great way to get a real sense of, can you go with this site? Now, obviously, the PIs, they need to continue to understand qualified personnel are critical to the appropriate conduct of a trial. And we need to determine with any new changes or additional study requirements, do they have enough personnel? What do we and what can we as sponsors do to help them bring on any additional personnel for conducting trials we want to put with them? With the site selection, we have always talked about making sure that the sites have access to the patients. And we all struggle with the best of sites to be sure that they can screen and recruit and enroll according to the protocols. So we need to be sure that any center, any perhaps smaller centers that we really are interested in bringing on board are perhaps recognized by key opinion leaders who can help them, who can maybe answer some questions, maybe provide some of the smaller centers some guidance and support as they start to bring on studies again. And so having that network is important, but it's also a way for the KOLs perhaps to help find referring centers or referring clinicians to help any new center come on board. We want to have a sense of whether they are published. When we talk about some of the larger centers, We want to be sure that they're very comfortable in what we may determine from discussion with our own CROs around how they've performed. Now, granted, we always know with any site, we have to be very careful in what we are saying to them about known information that certainly comes from a CRO or maybe our own history of working with a particular site. But we do need to bring up any aspects that we want to be sure a site now knows we have to pay a bit more attention to. And we want to be sure we are selecting sites that are very happy about partnering with advocacy groups, recruitment vendors, patient engagement partners. I think we have all at some point seen that there are certain sites that say, I don't need any help, and will say, I can recruit all on my own. And then trying to bring these kinds of support to them after the fact, when we're behind the curve, is not necessarily the best way to go. Right now, with the current environment, advocacy groups, especially around some of the unique indications, rare disease or unique therapy being developed, they are very helpful from the get-go. And the recruitment and the patient engagement partners, whether it's from the CRO who's helping us run the trial or whether it's a third party coming in at the start, is very important, because what they will do is basically provide the sites what they need, and they are also paying very close attention to some of the changes that have been taking place. Informed consent with the sites is going to become extremely important, and we need to be looking at sites who have certainly understood the importance and the purpose of the informed consent. I know 20 long pages plus sometimes is very difficult. They get very tired of doing that. It's one of the biggest protocol deviations we find again and again. If an informed consent has been updated and the site is still using the old one, the whole point of it, though, is to be sure that the purpose is understood, that it's about transparency with the subject, the patient, and it's all about the safety information. Now we've moved into the COVID-19, we've moved into some virtual work, we've moved into remote aspects. So we want to be sure that we are flexible and we streamline the approach. We want those informed consents, and those sites want the informed consents. To be clear, concise, specific. But we want to be able to work with sites that are comfortable doing e-consent, virtual consent, by Zoom, by what GoToMeeting, whatever the technology may be, because this remote consenting approach may play a bit more of a role. If you are still thinking about how you're going to handle the 2 or 3 times as many subjects to go through screening versus those who become enrolled, and time plays into this. Sites aren't necessarily going to want to be bringing in 5, 6, 7, 10 potential subjects into a site on the same day, but the remote approach may work. The key for us is making sure that the site understands the requirements on the diligence of explaining and going through the informed consent hasn't changed, and that at some point they need to be able to work out how the consent form comes back to them as at the site, because that is going to be critical down the road. So speaking about this approach and then making sure the site is willing or perhaps already has some experience in how to put these kinds of things into place when speaking to potential subjects plays into as we select sites. The remote monitoring and risk management, I've been mentioning it a couple of times already as we've gone forward. There can't be enough discussed around this. Excuse me, whether we're talking about the ongoing studies or whether we talk about new studies with new centers and new sites. Remote working versus remote monitoring. There has to be a clear understanding of the differences there. Any backlog because perhaps of the slowdown and the stop as they start back up is critical, and then to be able to continue to manage things going forward so that there can be clean end of study and closeout of activities. We need to be nimble, they need to be nimble, and that's going to become really important. Some of the discussions that I've been having, some of the state institutions are worried that they cannot be as nimble, and it was already tough with some of those. So we need to be looking at the sites, again, thinking about them as we select them. If they have the patience, they have the experience. What can we do? What can the CRO help us do to bring those sites on board rather than lose them? All the more frequent communications between sites and CROs becomes important, and between the CROs back to the sites on our behalf becomes important. This will help us, whether we talk about feasibility questionnaires, whether we talk about getting the studies started, these really become important discussions. I've already mentioned timelines. We've talked about, just briefly, I've talked about the subject risk assessments. Are they going to be requiring the subjects to come in with PPE? Are we going to have to provide that? Is a site basically saying, we know what we need, what we use for your trial, then that's what we expect you to cover or replace. So we need to know these kinds of things now as we are selecting sites. They aren't things we necessarily had to think about before, but they are now. IP, availability, and delivery. If it is a long trial, does the site really need to have the patient come in and go through all the process of picking everything up? Are there different ways in between visits to get IP to the sites? Do the sites have that capability? Do they want us to do it? So we will have to talk about these things with the sites, the CROs, our depots, in fact. There is one thing, though, that all parties, including the site, needs to keep in mind, that the drug accountability requirement doesn't go away. So how are they, as sites, able to do this if we take some different approaches than normally we have in the past? And what will the CRO help them with? What do we need to help them with? But the expectations have to be discussed up front, not later. I want to talk just briefly about data management. Yes?
Pardon my interruption, Nancy.
No, go ahead.
Excellent presentation, but we're just running a little over. If I could ask you to maybe take a
Oh, I'm sorry. I started almost 15 minutes later. I didn't realize we were cutting the time. I'm sorry if I didn't understand
you get your full allotted time. You're okay. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. For the data management piece, again, I do want to bring up, it will be about the quality of the site, the risk management and monitoring, and certainly how technology can be leveraged. Technology with vendors, technology at the sites I've already mentioned. Telemedicine here, perhaps in a little bit broader scale manner. Telemedicine approaches for doing questionnaires. Telemedicine for in place of bringing a subject in to do certain tracking of how they've been doing since the last visit, a telemedicine approach to just keep them engaged. The sites need to know that this becomes important for us to be collecting data, but protocol compliance as well. How do we make sure, even in the current new situation, data entry is timely and complete, because now that also becomes a different level of risk management. And I'm now on the last slide, so hopefully we have a little bit of time for any questions. What we need to be thinking about next, for and from the sites as we select them and as they become involved in conducting our studies. It is about staying engaged at all levels. It is about transparency and communication. It is about improving collaboration with them. We as sponsors have taken on the role at times of dictating to the CROs, this is what we want. The CROs have taken that message back to the sites and said, here's what you need to do. I mentioned right up front, flexibility and adaptability now is very important, and it really becomes about collaborating, listening to the sites, listening to the CRO, and vice versa, because that will help us run effective, successful studies. Accelerating right now a bit the technology used for the virtual trial approach. And we need to be cognizant of, it's going to evolve at the site level, it's going to evolve for us as well. Remote monitoring, again, effectiveness of it is critical. We're going to have to get better with the sites on triaging protocol deviations. What are the critical items related to the regulations, related to the disease, related to the IP that we need to monitor and be willing to step away from some of the smaller things, and rather than chasing the sites, which they don't want to be chased for 90 days on something really small, but really focusing on the critical deviations. Have they already thought about it? Talking to potential sites about that is really going to be valuable. I've mentioned the e and remote consenting approach. We need to streamline what we're doing to stay focused on priorities for the trial, for the sites, and for the patients. And by the way, as I have mentioned all of these things, we won't lose sight of the fact that we're going to have to manage the costs a little differently. Anything additional that a site now has to comply with for our studies, that's got to go into the study budgets. And anything we need to do differently with CROs as sponsors will also be reflected in the budgets. So that again comes back to having a very strong partnership, talking about expectations up front, and in such being able to select some of the best sites to run our trials in a collaborative and effective way. I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Nancy. That was a very well done, detailed presentation on things we need to be aware of with site selection and recruitment. I've been monitoring for questions, and there haven't been any questions that surfaced right now. But I know that Sam and his team will be circulating back any questions that come up at a later point in case you'd like to respond to those directly. But thank you very much for your presentation. It was very well done.
Thank you.